The crystal glasses on the dining table were polished to a lethal shine, reflecting a marriage that looked perfect only when broken into jagged pieces. Elena called it a conscious uncoupling dinner, a final performance for our friends to prove we were ending things with grace. But the USB drive weighing down my tuxedo pocket told a different story. I watched her adjust the centerpiece, her smile practiced and porcelain thin, unaware that the projector sitting innocently in the corner was about to burn her curated reality to the ground. There are secrets that can survive silence, but none that can survive the light. If you find yourself drawn to the quiet devastation of betrayal and the calculated coldness of revenge, stay with me. The dinner is just beginning, and the most dangerous course hasn't been served yet. Don't look away. The tie was silk, midnight blue, and it felt like a noose. Julian Vance stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master bedroom, adjusting the knot with the mechanical precision of a man defusing a bomb. Behind him, the reflection of the Chicago skyline shimmered in the twilight, a grid of indifferent lights watching him prepare for the performance of his life. "Do you think the hydrangeas are too much?" Elena's voice floated in from the hallway, light and airy, devoid of the friction that had defined their last 6 months. She appeared in the doorway, wearing a dress that cost more than his first car, a sleek silver sheath meant to signal elegance, mourning, and liberation all at once. She looked beautiful. She looked like a stranger he had shared a bed with for 5 years. "They're fine, Elle," Julian said, his voice steady. He turned to face her, smoothing the lapels of his tuxedo. "It's a dinner party, not a funeral." "It's a celebration of a new chapter," she corrected gently, walking over to brush a piece of invisible lint from his shoulder. Her touch was cool, professional. "We promised we'd do this right. No bitterness. Just two adults acknowledging that their paths have diverged." Julian forced the corner of his mouth up. It was a muscle memory, not a smile. "Right. The civilized way." "Exactly." She stepped back, assessing him like a sculpture she was about to auction off. "Did you finish the slideshow? The one for the projector?" Julian patted the left pocket of his jacket. He could feel the cold, rectangular outline of the USB drive against his ribs. It sat there like a loaded gun. "It's all ready. Just like you asked. All the memories." "Good," she sighed, a sound of genuine relief. "I want people to understand that just because we're ending doesn't mean we failed. I want them to see the love that was there, especially with Mark and the board members coming. It's important for the gallery's image that I look stable." Mark, his business partner. The man who had sat across from Julian at a desk for a decade, and who had been lying in Julian's bed for the last year. "Mark will be impressed," Julian said, turning back to the mirror to hide the sudden, sharp contraction of his pupils. "I think everyone will be surprised by what I've put together." "You're the best, Julian. Really." She checked her phone, her thumb scrolling rapidly. "I know this is unconventional. Most people just sign papers and hate each other. But we're better than that." "We certainly are." Elena left to check on the caterers, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floors, a countdown ticking away the final minutes of her carefully constructed life. Julian remained in the bedroom for a moment longer. The silence of the penthouse was oppressive, pressurized. He walked over to the nightstand and picked up his phone. No new messages. He didn't need any. The dossier was complete. He had spent 3 weeks compiling it. Every text message she thought she had deleted. The bank transfers labeled as consulting fees. the footage from the dash cam she didn't know recorded audio. He walked out into the living room. The dining table was set for 12. Crystal stemware, bone china, silver chargers reflecting the ambient lighting. It was a masterpiece of domestic theater. In the corner, the projector screen was already pulled down, a blank white canvas waiting for paint. Julian approached the projector sitting on a small pedestal. He reached into his pocket, withdrew the USB drive, and plugged it in. The little blue light on the device blinked once, twice, then held steady. "Ready?" Elena called from the kitchen, her voice bright with false cheer. Julian ran his hand over the projector's lens, checking for dust. "More than you know," he whispered. The doorbell rang. The first guests had arrived. Julian straightened his spine, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door to welcome the audience. The door opened to reveal the Westcotts, a couple whose primary contribution to society was chairing galas and spreading rumors. They swept in with a gust of chilly Chicago air and expensive perfume, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced sympathy. "Oh, you two," Sarah Westcott cooed, bypassing the coat check to embrace Elena. "I was just telling David in the elevator, this is so brave, truly modern." "We're trying to set an example," Elena said, her voice dropping to a register of humble nobility. She squeezed Julian's arm, her fingers digging slightly into his bicep. "Right, darling?" "Absolutely," Julian said. He took David's coat, feeling the heavy wool. Why burn bridges when you can simply admire the view from opposite sides? David chuckled, clapping Julian on the shoulder. "Good man. Takes a lot of character to handle a split like this. Most guys would be at a bar, not hosting a dinner party." "I have my coping mechanisms," Julian replied dryly. He gestured toward the open bar cart. "Please, help yourselves to the Cabernet. It's the 15 vintage. We were saving it for an anniversary, but tonight seemed appropriate." As the room filled, the air grew thick with the hum of polite conversation. There were 12 guests in total, a curated mix of mutual friends, key investors in Julian's firm, and influential board members from Elena's gallery. It was a strategic audience. Elena had selected them to witness her grace. Julian had approved them to witness her ruin. Then, the elevator chimed again. The conversation in the room didn't stop, but it shifted frequency. Mark entered. He looked effortless, wearing a suit that mirrored Julian's in cut, but screamed a louder, trendier ambition. Mark didn't just walk into a room, he campaigned through it. Julian watched from the edge of the living room, gripping the stem of his wine glass until his knuckles turned white. This was the man he had built a firm with, the man he had trusted with his clients, his capital, and unknowingly, his wife. Mark made a beeline for Elena first, a quick, chaste kiss on the cheek that lingered a fraction of a second too long for a casual friend. Then he turned to Julian. "Jules," Mark said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his palms dry, the handshake of a man with no conscience. "How are you holding up? Elena told me you've been a rock through all this." Julian took the hand. He looked Mark in the eye, searching for a flicker of guilt, a tremor of hesitation. There was nothing, just the flat blue stare of a shark in shallow water. "I'm focusing on the details, Mark," Julian said, releasing the hand slowly. "You know me. I like to make sure everything is accounted for." "That's why you're the best architect in the city," Mark laughed, turning to the group. "This guy sees angles the rest of us miss." "I'm starting to see things much clearer lately," Julian murmured, though the comment was lost in the clinking of glasses. Elena clapped her hands gently to gather attention. She stood by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows against her white skin. "Everyone, thank you for coming. I know this is a bit unusual, but Julian and I wanted to share a meal with the people who mean the most to us before we transition." Transition, Julian repeated internally. A corporate word for a personal demolition. "Julian has even prepared a little presentation," Elena added, beaming at him. "A look back at the good times. To show that love doesn't just disappear." Across the room, Mark caught Elena's eye. It was a micro-expression, a subtle raising of the brow, a smirk tucked into the corner of his mouth. It was a look of victory. They thought they had won. They thought Julian was the useful idiot, curating a monument to their ego while they plotted to steal his equity. Julian raised his glass in their direction. The crystal caught the light, refracting it into a spectrum of sharp, jagged colors. "I think you'll find it very illuminating," Julian said loud enough for the room to hear. "To maturity," David Westcott toasted. "To the truth," Julian corrected, taking a sip of the blood-red wine. "Shall we sit?" Elena asked, gesturing to the table. "The chef has prepared something special." As the guests drifted toward the dining area, Julian lingered by the projector. He ran a finger over the power button. The fan inside the machine whirred to life, a low hum that sounded like a storm warning. He wasn't just hungry for dinner. He was starving for the end. The first course was a beef carpaccio, served on slate plates that looked too heavy for the delicate white tablecloth. Julian stared at the thin, translucent slices of raw meat, finding the visual violently appropriate. Across the table, the conversation had settled into a low, self-congratulatory hum. The guests were discussing the stock market, the latest gallery acquisitions, and the sheer elegance of this divorce, treating the dissolution of a marriage like a successful merger. Mark sat to Elena's right. It was a breach of traditional etiquette. That seat belonged to the host, but Elena had insisted. "He's family," she had whispered to Julian earlier. Now Julian watched as Mark leaned in to refill Elena's water glass, his hand lingering near hers on the stemware. It was a gesture so familiar, so practiced, that Julian wondered how he had been blind to it for so long. Elena picked up her spoon, then set it down. It was the cue. She tapped her fork against her champagne flute. The crystal rang out, a sharp, piercing note that silenced the room instantly. She stood up, smoothing the front of her silver dress. Her eyes were shimmering, moist enough to suggest heartbreak, but clear enough to maintain her beauty. She was, Julian realized, a master of lighting. "Thank you all for being here," Elena began, her voice trembling slightly. "Most people think divorce is a failure. But looking around this table, looking at Julian," she paused, turning her gaze toward him. It was a look of tender, fabricated affection. "I don't see failure. I see evolution." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the guests. Sarah Westcott dabbed at her eye with a napkin. "Julian and I have loved each other deeply," Elena continued, placing a hand over her heart. "But we've realized that sometimes love changes shape. It becomes friendship. It becomes respect. We didn't want to end this in a lawyer's office fighting over assets. We wanted to end it here, breaking bread with the people who have supported us. Like Mark." She gestured to Mark, who lowered his head modestly. "Mark, who has been a brother to Julian and a pillar for me," she said. "We are so lucky to have a community that understands that an ending can be beautiful." She raised her glass. "To the past, and to a future where we all remain family." "To the future," the guests echoed in unison. Elena drank, her eyes locking with Mark's over the rim of the glass. Then, she turned to Julian. The stage direction was clear. Now the husband speaks, validates the lie, and sits down. "Julian," she said softly, "did you want to add anything before we start the slideshow?" The room turned to him, 12 pairs of eyes, waiting for the gracious acceptance speech. Julian pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against the floor was loud, harsh. He stood up slowly, picking up his glass of dark red wine. He didn't look at the guests. He looked directly at Elena, then shifted his gaze to Mark. "Elena is right," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, stripping the warmth from the room. "We often misunderstand the nature of endings. We think they are sudden events. But as an architect, I can tell you that a collapse never happens all at once. It happens in the dark, in the foundation, cracks spreading while the facade remains perfectly painted." The smile on Mark's face faltered slightly. Elena tilted her head, confused by the shift in tone. "Tonight isn't just about saying goodbye," Julian continued, walking slowly toward the head of the table. "It's about clarity. It's about seeing things and people exactly as they are, without the benefit of shadows." Elena spoke about transparency, about not hiding in lawyers' offices. He stopped behind his empty chair. He swirled the wine in his glass. "So, I prepared something that honors that spirit, a tribute to the truth of the last 6 months." He didn't raise his glass for a toast. He drank the wine in one swallow, setting the empty glass down with a deliberate clack. "I think we should skip the speeches," Julian said, his eyes cold and hard as flint, "and go straight to the projector." The room was silent. The air felt thin, electric. Elena's smile had frozen into a rigid mask. She didn't know what was wrong, but for the first time all night she looked afraid. "Julian," she whispered, "watch the screen," he commanded softly. Julian turned his back on them and walked into the shadows of the corner, reaching for the remote. Julian pressed a button on the wall panel, and the recessed lighting in the dining room died, plunging the space into a heavy, velvety darkness. The only illumination came from the city lights bleeding through the glass walls, distant, indifferent spectators to the domestic collapse about to unfold, and the bright, humming beam of the projector. The screen descended with a soft, mechanical whir, unrolling like a scroll of judgment. "This is such a lovely idea," Sarah Westcott whispered in the dark, her voice thick with the earlier wine. "I wish David was this romantic." Elena sat straight in her chair, her silhouette rigid against the glow of the screen. She turned slightly toward Mark, offering him a reassuring smile that was lost in the shadows. She was still confident, still believing that Julian was the tame, broken man she had manipulated for months. The first slide clicked into place. It was a photo from their wedding day, 5 years ago. They were standing on the steps of the Art Institute, the wind catching Elena's veil. A collective sigh of appreciation rippled through the guests. It was the perfect opening. Nostalgic, beautiful, safe. "We were happy then." Julian's voice cut through the darkness. He stood by the projector, his face half lit by the blue spill of the lens. "We believed in loyalty. We believed in partnership." He pressed the remote. The slide changed. The second image was from their honeymoon in Tuscany. Sun-drenched hills, wine glasses raised. "But memory is a tricky thing," Julian continued, his tone conversational, almost academic. "It edits out the details we don't want to see. It hides the cracks in the foundation." He pressed the remote again. The screen flickered. The warm, saturated colors of Tuscany vanished, replaced by a harsh, grainy black and white image. It wasn't a photograph. It was a scanned document, a hotel invoice. The room remained silent for a beat, the guests squinting to make sense of the change in aesthetic. The text on the screen was magnified, sharp, and undeniable. The Conrad Hotel, Presidential Suite, August 14th. Guest name, Mark S. Sterling. Additional guest, Elena Vance. The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't the silence of respect anymore. It was the silence of confusion, of synapses firing, trying to reconcile the data. August 14th, Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. Elena, you told me you were in Miami for Art Basel. You sent me photos of the beach. But Art Basel is in December. And this invoice, this is from Chicago, 3 blocks from my office. Julian? Elena's voice cracked. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. What is this? You must have the wrong file. Do I? Julian clicked the remote. The screen changed again. This time, it wasn't a document. It was a screenshot of a text message thread. The bubble color was green. Elena's phone. The contact name at the top was M. Elena, 11:42 p.m. He's asleep. Did you talk to the lawyer about the offshore account? M, 11:43 p.m. It's done. We frame the withdrawal as a bad investment on his part. He won't even notice until the audit. And by then, we'll be clear. A gasp, sharp and involuntary, came from the end of the table. One of the board members had put down his fork, the metal clattering loudly against the china. Mark shot up from his chair. The movement was violent, knocking his wine glass over. The dark liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a gunshot wound. "Turn it off," Mark snarled, his charm evaporating instantly. "Julian, turn it off. This is sick. You've hacked our phones?" "I didn't hack anything, Mark," Julian said, stepping fully into the light of the projector, his shadow looming large over the table. "You two were careless. You synced your devices to the home network. You assumed I was too stupid to look, too trusting." "Julian, stop this." Elena stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for the tablecloth. "This is a misunderstanding. You're taking things out of context to humiliate me." "Context?" Julian laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "I think the context is very clear, Elena. You aren't leaving me because we grew apart. You're leaving because you and my business partner devised a plan to embezzle $2 million from the firm and leave me with the liability." He pointed the remote at the screen again. "But wait," Julian said, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying clarity. "We haven't even gotten to the video yet." The guests were frozen, paralyzed by the social horror of the moment. They were trapped in the blast radius, witnessing a murder-suicide of reputations. The projector hummed on, indifferent to the panic rising in the room, waiting to deliver the next slide. The screen flickered once, a jagged tear of static, before stabilizing into a wide-angle shot. It was a security feed, grainy and monochromatic, time-stamped 3 weeks prior. The angle was high, looking down into Julian's home office, the one room in the penthouse Elena had sworn she never entered because it bored her. On the screen, 2 figures stood by Julian's mahogany desk. Even in the low resolution, their body language was unmistakable. Mark was leaning back in Julian's leather chair, feet up on the desk, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. Elena was sitting on the edge of the desk, laughing. The audio hissed, then popped into clarity. "He's so meticulous about the blueprints," Mark's recorded voice sneered, echoing through the silent dining room. but he doesn't look at the operating accounts. He trusts me. He trusts everyone, Elena's voice replied on the recording. It was light, mocking, the same tone she used when discussing a waiter who had messed up an order. That's why this is going to be so easy. We liquidate the joint holding in the Caymans, claim market volatility, and by the time the auditors wake up, I'll have the settlement signed. In the dining room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The board member, a man named Sterling who had invested heavily in Julian's firm, stood up slowly. His face was gray. "That's the operating fund," Sterling murmured, his voice shaking. "Mark, that's the client operating fund." Mark didn't look at Sterling. He was staring at the screen, his face twisted into a rictus of panic and rage. He looked like an animal realizing the trap had already snapped shut. "It's a deep fake," Mark shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged toward the projector, his movements frantic. "He faked it! Technology can do anything now! Don't listen to this!" Julian didn't flinch. He simply took a half step to the left, placing himself between Mark and the machine. "Sit down, Mark," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "Unless you want to explain to the Illinois Bar Association why you physically assaulted a man after he exposed your felony." Mark froze. His hands were balled into fists, trembling at his sides. He looked at the guests, the elite of Chicago, the people whose validation he craved like oxygen. They were staring at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. The social contract that protected him had evaporated. On the screen, the video continued. Mark reached out and pulled Elena into his lap. They kissed. A hungry, possessive act that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with conquest. "Poor Julian," Elena said on the tape, pulling away, breathless. "He's going to build us a fortune and not even know he paid for it." In the present, Elena let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. The silver dress that had looked like armor an hour ago now looked like a costume she had been caught wearing. "Turn it off," she pleaded, her voice muffled by her palms. "Julian, please, I'm begging you, turn it off." "Begging?" Julian asked, tilting his head. "That's a new look for you, Elle. I thought we were doing this with dignity." "This isn't dignity!" she shrieked, dropping her hands to reveal a face ravaged by shame. Mascara had begun to run, a black tear tracking down her cheek. "This is torture. You're destroying everything." "I'm not destroying anything," Julian corrected her cold, architectural precision. "I'm just turning on the lights. You're the one who built the ruin." He looked at the guests. Most of them had pushed their chairs back, distancing themselves from the table as if the corruption were contagious. The Westcotts were already standing, Sarah clutching her purse to her chest. "I think we should go," David Westcott said, his voice tight. He wouldn't look at Elena. "Nobody leaves yet," Julian said. He didn't raise his voice, but the command stopped David in his tracks. Julian pressed the remote one last time. "Because the video isn't finished, and neither is the money." The screen shifted again. This time, it wasn't a video. It was a bank statement, a transfer confirmation. But it wasn't to an offshore account. It was a transfer from Mark's personal account to a private investigator. The memo line read, "Dirt on J. Vance, manufacturing evidence." Mark's face went slack. The fight drained out of him instantly. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He knew, in that second, that Julian hadn't just caught them stealing. Julian had caught them trying to frame him. "You wanted a show," Julian said to the silent, terrified room. "So watch." The silence that followed the final slide was not the silence of peace. It was the vacuum created before a structure collapses. The projector hummed, a monotonous, mechanical heartbeat, in a room where every human heart seemed to have stopped. David Westcott was the first to move. He didn't look at Julian, and he certainly didn't look at Elena. He looked at his watch, a reflex of the wealthy when confronted with the grotesque. "We have to go," David muttered, his voice tight. He grabbed Sarah's elbow with enough force to bruise. "Now!" "David, wait!" Elena stammered, stepping forward, her hand reaching out but finding only empty air. "You can't just leave. Let me explain. It's complicated. The context is fraud, Elena," Sarah hissed, pulling her arm away from her husband, but stepping back from Elena as if she were radioactive. "You involved us. You sat there and let us toast to a crime. Do you have any idea what this does to the board's reputation?" "Sarah, please," Elena begged, her eyes darting around the room, seeking a sympathetic face. There were none. The other guests were already moving, a synchronized exodus of cashmere and silk. Chairs scraped violently against the hardwood. Purses were snatched from tables. The polite veneer of Chicago society had peeled away, revealing the cold pragmatism underneath. No one wanted to be subpoenaed. No one wanted to be a character witness. Julian remained standing by the projector, watching the scramble with the detached interest of a scientist observing insects under glass. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't need to. They were carrying the story out into the world for him. By morning, everyone from the Art Institute to the frantic trading floors of the Loop would know what Elena Vance had done. Then, there was Mark. He had pulled himself up from the floor, his suit jacket rumpled, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at the door, calculating the distance. "Mark," Elena whispered. She turned to him, her eyes wide with a desperate hope. "Mark, tell them. Tell them we had a plan. Tell them it's not what it looks like." Mark didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He was already moving toward the elevator, his stride jerky and uneven. "Mark!" Elena screamed, the sound tearing through the penthouse. "Where are you going?" "I have to call my lawyer," Mark mumbled, his voice trembling. He punched the elevator button repeatedly, his thumb jamming against the plastic. "I have to. I need to get ahead of this." "You're leaving me?" Elena asked, her voice dropping to a stunned whisper. "Here? With him?" The elevator doors slid open. Mark stepped inside, finally turning to face the room. His eyes met Julian's for a fleeting second, a look of pure, abject terror, before he hit the button for the lobby. He didn't spare Elena a single glance. The doors slid shut, sealing him away, erasing him from the narrative he had helped write. The remaining guests filtered out behind him, the heavy front door clicking shut one by one until the latch engaged for the final time. The sound echoed in the vast, open-plan living room. Suddenly, the penthouse was enormous and empty. Julian walked over to the table. The food was cold. The wine was breathing, oxidizing in the open air. He picked up the bottle of Cabernet, poured himself a fresh glass, and sat down at the head of the table, the seat Elena had reserved for herself. Elena stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 12 empty chairs, and the projected image of her own betrayal still glowing on the screen. Her chest heaved. The tears had stopped, replaced by a rigid, vibrating tension. She looked at the closed door, then slowly turned to face Julian. The mask was completely gone now. There was no more sadness, no more conscious uncoupling. There was only the raw, ugly face of a narcissist who had lost control. "Are you happy?" she spat, the words dripping with venom. "You ruined my life. You humiliated me in front of everyone who matters. Is that what you wanted? To be the big man?" Julian took a sip of wine. He swirled the liquid, watching the legs run down the side of the glass. "Sit down, Elena," he said quietly. "We haven't had dessert." "I'm not sitting down with you," she screamed, grabbing a crystal glass from the table and hurling it at the wall. It shattered, raining shards of glass onto the pristine floor. "You're a monster! You planned this! You let me set this whole dinner up just to ambush me!" "I didn't plan the dinner, Elena," Julian replied, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You did. I just provided the entertainment." He looked up at her, his eyes dark and impenetrable. "And you're right. I did ruin your life. But you're the one who signed the invoice." The morning after the dinner, the sun rose over Lake Michigan with a cruel, brilliant clarity, illuminating the wreckage of the penthouse living room. The shattered crystal still lay on the floor, diamonds of glass catching the light. Julian stepped over them carefully as he made his coffee. He didn't clean it up. He wanted the house cleaners to see it. He wanted the forensic accountants to see it. By noon, the silence was broken not by Elena, who had fled to her mother's estate in Lake Forest, but by the ringing of phones that wouldn't stop. The fallout was swift, nuclear, and entirely public. Elena had tried to get ahead of the story. A source close to Mrs. Vance had leaked a narrative to the Chicago Tribune gossip column, painting Julian as a paranoid, controlling husband who had staged a psychotic break at a private dinner. But the narrative failed to take root because the digital footprint was too deep. The guests, initially terrified of scandal, had turned into sources of their own. They didn't want to be associated with embezzlement. To save themselves, they confirmed Julian's version of events. 3 days later, Julian sat in a conference room on the 45th floor of a Wacker Drive skyscraper. The room smelled of lemon polish and billable hours. Across the long mahogany table sat Elena. She looked smaller than she had at the dinner, her vibrancy drained away, replaced by a hollow, nervous exhaustion. She wore no jewelry. Next to her was a high-priced divorce attorney known for shredding prenuptials. But today, he looked like a man trying to defuse a bomb with a pair of safety scissors. Mark was absent. "Mr. Sterling has resigned from the firm, effective immediately," Julian's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca, stated calmly. She slid a document across the table. "He has also agreed to full cooperation regarding the unauthorized withdrawals from the client operating fund in exchange for leniency regarding the pressing of criminal charges." Elena flinched. The mention of Mark's capitulation was a physical blow. The man who had promised her a new life had cut a deal to save his own skin before the ink was even dry on his resignation letter. "My client," Elena's lawyer began, clearing his throat, "maintains that she had no knowledge of the specific source of the funds. She was under the impression they were profits from—" "Stop," Julian said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Elena, we watched the video. We heard you laughing about it. You called me poor Julian. You knew exactly where the money came from." Elena looked up. Meeting his eyes for the first time, there was no love left, not even hate. just a terrified calculation. "You destroyed the firm, Julian," she whispered. "The reputation, it's gone. Investors are pulling out. You burned your own house down just to catch a rat." "The house was already rotten," Julian replied. "I just decided not to live in it anymore." Rebecca tapped the settlement agreement. "The terms are non-negotiable, Mrs. Vance. You walk away with what you came into the marriage with, which, according to our records, is a lease on a hatchback and a student loan debt we paid off in year 2. You waive all rights to the firm's future earnings. In exchange, Julian does not hand over the full unredacted tapes to the district attorney." Elena's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear. It was a short conversation. There was no leverage. The projector had done its work. Elena picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, the tip of the Mont Blanc hovering over the signature line. "I loved you once," she said, a final desperate attempt to rewrite history. "I know," Julian said, watching her sign away her future. "That's what made the betrayal so expensive." She signed. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of a guillotine blade finally hitting the block. Julian stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt light, untethered, like an astronaut whose gravity tether had been cut. He walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving Elena alone with her lawyer and the silence of a life that had been meticulously dismantled. The elevator ride down took 40 seconds. When the doors opened to the lobby, the noise of the city rushed in. Sirens, traffic, voices, life was continuing. He stepped out onto the street, took a breath of cold air, and hailed a cab. He had no wife. He had a broken business. But for the first time in 6 months, he didn't have to lie. The penthouse sounded different when it was empty. Without the plush rugs, the velvet sofas, and the heavy gallery-style art that Elena had curated, the space was an echo chamber. Every footstep Julian took on the hardwood floor rang out with a sharp, hollow clarity, bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows that still framed the indifferent gray expanse of Lake Michigan. It had been 3 weeks since the settlement was signed. 2 weeks since the firm was formally dissolved and rebranded under a new partnership that didn't include Mark. And 48 hours since the sale of the apartment had closed. Julian stood in the center of the living room, holding a single cardboard box. It was the last one. It didn't contain much, just a few personal drafting tools, a framed photograph of his parents, and the small, portable projector. He looked toward the dining area. The table was gone, sold at auction along with the rest of the furniture. There was nothing to mark the spot where the farewell dinner had taken place. No scar on the floor to show where Mark had collapsed or where Elena had shattered the crystal glass. The physical evidence of the night had been swept away, scrubbed clean by professional cleaners who didn't ask questions about wine stains that looked like blood. But the memory was burned into the architecture of the room. Julian could still see the ghost of the screen descending, the blue light of the projector cutting through the dark, exposing the rot beneath the floorboards. He walked over to the window, resting his free hand against the cool glass. People had called him ruthless. In the days following the dinner, as the story circulated through the whispers of the loop, he had been painted as a cold-blooded tactician who had lured his wife into a trap. Perhaps they were right. But looking at the empty space now, Julian didn't feel like a villain. He didn't feel like a hero either. He felt like a surgeon who had successfully amputated a gangrenous limb. The patient had survived, but he would never walk quite the same way again. The buzzer at the door rang, jarring him from his thoughts. It was the realtor. Mr. Vance? Her voice echoed from the hallway. The new owners are scheduled for the final walkthrough at 2. I'm just leaving, Julian called back. His voice was steady. He shifted the box in his arms. He looked down at the projector nestled inside. For a moment, he considered leaving it there, a strange, modern artifact for the new owners to find. A warning, perhaps. But that was melodrama, and he was done with theater. He had used the truth as a weapon because he had to, not because he enjoyed the bloodshed. He turned his back on the view. He turned his back on the spot where he used to stand and drink coffee with a woman he thought he knew. Julian walked to the front door. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the light switch. He didn't say goodbye. There was no one left to talk to, and the room didn't care. It was just glass and steel and drywall. It was never a home. It was just a stage, and the play was finally over. He flipped the switch. The lights died, plunging the empty room into the gray afternoon shadow. Julian stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy door shut. The latch clicked, a solid, final sound that felt more satisfying than any applause. He walked toward the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and waited to go down to the street. Where the air was cold, the noise was loud, and everything was real.